Thank you. Well, we hope this conference would include a certain measure of the how-to, not just the why should I. And this topic is something that doesn't get talked about a lot in the conversations about culture. And yet it is, as you see from the title slide, where culture meets the road. Because how you make decisions, as Ron just told us, are systems of decision making. How you make those decisions send messages. And it's also the basis of whether or not people can feel safe in the organization, whether or not the organization is healthy and it can continue and sustain itself and livelihoods going forward. So what is the connection between compensation and culture? What do you think might be some of the connections in how people are paid, how they earn their opportunities, how they earn advancement? What could be the connection with culture? Sing out if you have an idea. Competition. It might instill a sense of battling against others, a culture of competition.
They feel valued.
Whether or not they feel valued.
Status.
And for what, right?
Status.
Where are they in the pecking order? I know Ron talked about trying to get rid of labels because it triggers our amygdala. And yet we are all in categories every day. It's part of what it means to be in an organization. You're in finance, you're in accounting, you're in human resources, you have a title. We are all in categories. So how do we deal with those categories is part of compensation. There are several elements to whether or not people feel engaged. And I really appreciate what Ron said about you can have high engagement for the wrong reasons. But there's a lot of research around some of the factors that cause people to feel positively engaged, and that's associated with higher performance and outcomes. One of those key factors is whether or not someone is optimistic about the future for themselves and for the organization. Do they see themselves in that future? Do they see that the organization can sustain them and their family's livelihood? So this key factor is all about compensation. I'm going to propose to you that one of the compensation strategies that you should have in your organization is around the need to retain people in hard times. What you see here on the screen is a list of gray bars, which are the recessions going back to 1948. Up through 2020 and 2021, you see that high spike. The blue line is the unemployment rate during and just after those recessions. A couple things are interesting about this. You notice that the period of the recession is relatively small. Well, that's the measurement of negative GDP. That doesn't mean that that's only the amount of pain that we felt. The pain is that long slide in going from high unemployment to low unemployment until the next recession. So, for example, in 2008 and 9, when we had the Great Recession, largest economic collapse since 1929. Unemployment, I don't know if you can see this here, was up around 11 or 12%. It took 7 years to return to the employment level that occurred prior to that recession. 7 years. That's a long time. So if you're not optimistic about the future, if you think that when a recession comes, your job is on the line and you're likely to be cut, then you can't think long term about your participation in that organization. You can't think about what I'm going to do in the next 3 to 5 years, because a part of you is always thinking about what do I do next month if I get laid off. So how do we build a compensation system that has both rewards in good times and protection of people in bad times? In my own company, before I joined WD-40, we never had a layoff because I built the system around retention. We could drop 20 to 30% in revenue and not have to lay anybody off. At WD-40 Company, in its 70-plus year history now, has never had to lay off anyone due to cost cutting. That allows people to think long term. So how do you build that kind of a system? It starts with a market analysis. A lot of companies don't, when they start growing, they don't do a market analysis. They negotiate one at a time. And that's a way of doing a market analysis because the law of supply and demand for that position in that moment will tell you what the market bears and what you have to pay. But you can't answer questions with that kind of a system about what can I make next year. You can't answer the question, what are my compensation costs going to be in the next 2 to 3 years? How do I plan for the business model that can sustain people if I don't have an estimate of where that commodity is going? So it does start with a market analysis. And what you get are salary ranges that go from low to high by function by department. Does that make sense? If you're going to build a company, you have to know what your cost structures are. And labor costs are one of the largest pieces of that cost structure. It's in direct and indirect labor and your cost of goods sold, and it's throughout your SG&A. So if you have a range, now I've done my cost study. I've done my labor market analysis. And I know for position X, it's going to pay anywhere from a low to a high. And there's going to be a distribution curve, right? Well, it's not a normal curve. Most compensation curves that show frequency distribution of pay according to a position is skewed to the right. It's a right-hand tail. So that the 90th percentile is further away from the median than the 10th percentile. Just keep that in mind. This is a stylized curve. It's not an actual curve. So how do you decide how much each person gets? If you're going to hire someone and you know this is a range, how do you decide what they get? Years of experience?
The type of industry.
Well, let's say this is an industry and a job that pays X to Y. You've got the data. But now you've got a candidate.
So we target the median, and if we feel that they can hit the ground running, then that's kind of where we start. If we feel they're going to need some development to get to that point, then we go to the range, like the 25th to the 50th.
You go lower.
We go lower.
And what if they can knock it out of the park and do more than what you ask?
Then it's higher.
Okay? So if you take that approach, you want to have people who hit the ground running, right? Who wants somebody who doesn't need any training? Right? How often do you get that? 0. But let's say that that's your philosophy, and everyone wants people who are just excellent. What happens to your cost structure if you hire people exactly? You're now leading the market. And if you're leading the market in your labor costs, you have a higher likelihood of being unable to afford them in a downturn. You have to decide who gets to stay. So there's a way to do this that not only increases engagement, where people want to be with you longer, it protects your labor costs so that you can experience a downturn without having to let people go. And it's about deciding where they are in their journey of competency. As Tanya just said, people who are not yet fully competent are typically not paid as much in the labor market. They're new to the role, they're entering into that range, and they haven't advanced in their abilities quite as far. Most of the people on the center of this curve are the folks who are fully competent, because that's the bulk of the frequency distribution, and it makes logical sense. The right-hand side is typically people who are getting ready to be promoted. They've been in that role for a long enough period of time that they're starting to do the role above that in the career progression, or contributing in other ways outside of their normal functions, which is more valuable. So the more valuable the contribution, the higher the pay in that job range. This turns out to be a pretty good way of making decisions about how much people are paid at the first time they join your company and as time goes on. So developing fully competent and advanced to own or to be placed in a certain part of the range. It's interesting that when people are developing and they're new to a role, they're excited. They don't know everything. They're curious. They want to be taught. And they're motivated to achieve and to be, if they know that they are developing. You have to tell them that. You have to show them that. Their engagement goes through the roof. And they create amazing things over time if you have a mentality that you're going to develop people. At WD-40 Company, it's about coaching. It's about leading and developing and teaching people. If you have that mentality, you will create a place where people want to come and grow and learn more and contribute more over time. And then you advance their pay accordingly. It also has the benefit of keeping your labor costs at a moderate level. Otherwise, if you hire all those people that hit the ground running and you're paying most of your people at the 75th percentile, you are now ahead of the market and difficult to sustain in hard times. To be able to do this, you have to know what the job requires. The humble job description that everyone thinks is just a piece of paper in a file or some regulatory compliance issue is the gem that creates the basis of so many things. What goes into a job description? What do you think should go into a job description? I can't hear you. Responsibilities. Or perhaps another way to call it is essential functions. What does this job do? What is the person who holds this job? What is their functional contribution? What kind of goals and objectives does this role have? What's the time span for their contribution? Is it on a minute-to-minute basis, like a production line? Or is it years into the future because they have strategic input on programs that take years to implement? But before that, what is the purpose of the role? Why does this role exist at all? I would offer to you that the first rule of hiring is to try the hell not to. If you can avoid hiring a role and your organization is successful, then you've just prevented an unneeded expense. So first rule of hiring is try to avoid it. If you can't avoid it, then you know exactly why you can't avoid it. You know the purpose and the essential functions that have to contribute to the success of the organization. So purpose, essential functions. What else goes into the job description? Values. That goes into every job description, right? As Rochelle taught us, that if you have values that you wish to maintain and live by because they're more important than money, then it has to be something that is a qualifying set of criteria for every role.
Experience, education, certifications.
Okay, so experiences that might get you to the place where you have the ability to perform the role. Side note, years of experience and educational level are not criterion valid predictors of performance in a role. They can be an indicator, but if you rely on those alone, or even majorly, you're more likely to make a mistake in your hiring. Licenses may be necessary regulatorily. Can't be a CPA without the ability in the state that you're in to perform that role. I would say those are preferred indicators, but I would be skeptical on education and years of experience by themselves. There's another element that needs to go into this. What is it?
Outcomes.
Results. Results over what period of time? What is the impact of the role on the business? One more ingredient. Who said that? You win. What are the competencies? What are the behavioral contributions in competency, skills, abilities, knowledge, problem solving? You have to be able to define those in the role. Otherwise, you can't follow Rochelle's good advice and apply a methodology of eliciting those behaviors to decide whether or not the person is developing, fully competent, advanced, or not qualified to have the role at all. That's a lot of work. Most companies don't like to do this work. But when you have that definition, that job profile, now you know how to compare to market, you know how to design the criteria for selection, you know how to explain to somebody why they are or are not capable of the next role that they covet, and you know how to teach them to get there. One of the things at WD-40 that just erupted spontaneously was leaders would sit down with the employees, with the job description, with the competencies, and they'd say, okay, you tell me where you think you're developing fully or advanced on each of these competencies. I'll do the same. We'll compare notes. Where there was agreement, then they knew what next had to happen in development efforts. Where there was disagreement, they had a rich dialogue of why their opinion differed. And either the leader hadn't told them how they arrived at it, or they just thought that the person knew, or the person didn't get the feedback they needed, positive or negative, or constructive. So you have to know what the job requires in all of those elements to be able to measure the market, set a development plan for people, help them advance, and earn more. Does that make sense? That little job description, it's incredibly important. So here's a model. You've gotten a lot of models. Hopefully this one will make sense to you as well. An organization starts out with its values. I put values before purpose because the values you have determine what purposes you'll even consider, what kind of business you would even be in. Then comes strategy in whatever business model, whatever industry you're in. What are we trying to accomplish, and what's the how-to for those accomplishments? Strategy is then divided into specific goals below that overarching vision. Those types of goals will then tell you what functions need to exist in order to accomplish the goals. There's water to your left down on the stage. Oh, thank you. You guys are good. Appreciate that. If you know what the functions are, then you know how to measure it. If you can't measure it, it doesn't happen, right? You can't tell if you're on your way to Milwaukee unless you know how many miles you've traveled. And then you get results. Whatever results you get informs the experiment. Now, is my strategy right or is it not right? Notice the arrow doesn't go up to values. If it did, you would not have values. You would have conditional ethical statements that may or may not be followed depending on the context and the results. So this is a cycle of experimentation. We're all in that business of experimenting. Next, what is the definition of a role within a function that one person can do? That's the job description we just talked about. What do I expect of performance to those metrics? And then finally, here's where compensation ties in. You pay for results, not for activity. There was a concept some years past called competency-based compensation, skills-based, so that you could earn more if you could show that now I can do this, I got a certificate for that, and you'd raise more pay. And what happened, it went away because labor costs rose when the results weren't there to pay for it. So I recommend compensation tied to results. Does that seem logical? So back to how do we decide to pay and allocate our labor dollars? Variable incentives provide an accelerator of performance and a safety valve to protect people. We're always trying in business models to push from the fixed cost to the variable cost, right? Because variable costs go up and down with your revenue. It's safer that way. So how do we do that with labor costs? First, you start with trying to moderate your labor costs around the median of your collective markets, maybe even a little below if you can. You do that by having people in developing range so that you're not always paying at the high end of the market. And that helps offset the times when you do have people that deserve to be paid in advance, or you have to hire people because you don't have that competency at all. At WD-40, we had to hire a manufacturing engineer. First time. We couldn't get somebody who was developing. No one knew how to teach him. So we got help in evaluating candidates. We had to hire an absolute expert. You'll have to do that. But by having more people in that developing range, you can moderate your fixed costs. Your variable incentives are then added to that to reward people in great times, and that is your total labor investment. That variable incentive provides a profit shock absorber in the times when your revenue drops or your margins shrink, so that you preserve that profit and that capital for shareholder returns, for investment, and for operating costs if you're pressured. Profit-based incentives is the best, in my view, for this type of purpose. There's equity, of course, and if you're in a startup or a non-public company that wants to go public, if you're in a public company, you typically will have equity as part of your compensation as well to align shareholder interests over the long term. But still, that equity value is going to be based on profit. The value of the entire company is going to be based on profit. I know we had an economic time when profit was no longer the objective in the dot-com era. Remember when people said, it's a new economy, profit doesn't matter? That lasted a couple years. But profit-based, or equity, if you have equity that is still based on profit because of its value, is the best. What happened, and again, WD-40 is an example. In the Great Recession, companies were losing 30 to 40% of their revenue. I was a chairman of a company that was doing about $200 million in 2008. In January of 2009, we dropped 40%. We had to lay off 1,000 people in plants all around the country. They didn't have this model. At WD-40, we had a pay freeze for 1 year. No benefits were cut. We didn't lose a single person. And as Gary said to us, he said, at the end of this economic turmoil, we're going to have at least one new person on board. And we were able to do that. I never had to lay anybody off in my 23 years in my consulting company. And we went through 2 recessions because we could take a 30% hit without having to let people go. Why is it so important not to let people go? Besides what I said on the part about engagement and their ability to think long term. What else is bad about it? You lose everything you've invested and everything they would contribute because they're not likely going to come back. It's the dumbest thing you can do as a business leader is to let people go that you coaxed, hired, developed, invested, and they contributed, and now they're gone. You have to recreate that whole thing over again. But that profit shock absorber allowed us at WD-40 to still return profit to our shareholders, operating capital, not have to increase our debt, and provided a security for our employees without more than a 1-year pay freeze. Now let's talk about some of the decisions we make and how we make them around compensation and what kind of cultural messages they send. Here's a practice that a lot of companies implement. Maybe none of you do, but I still see it. People nearing the top end of their range receive a lower annual pay adjustment than those in the early part of their range. As you get to the higher part of the salary range, for the same performance level, you would get a lower percent increase if you had a merit increase. Offers to new hires are aimed for the lowest possible amount they will accept. You negotiate with each individual, and if they say they want 120, but you know you could have paid 140, you give them 122. Roles are not openly communicated to internal candidates. People are promoted according to leadership's decision. You're appointed, you're selected. Certain people are selected for special programs or experiential opportunities because they're identified as being high potential. People are allowed to see only their own salary range and cannot view other position descriptions or ranges. Side note, the European Union has passed regulations that require transparency in their compensation systems. The UK is experimenting with that, and they're kind of going along the same lines. And multiple states in the United States have now said you have to publish the range. That's not the end of it. It's going to keep going. But there will still be companies that won't go along until they have to. And what is the message being sent here? Okay? So what I'd like you to do at your tables is try to identify at least one positive, and if you can, one negative message to each of these practices that these actions send out to the culture. All right, so I'm gonna randomly pick a table, and you randomly pick a spokesmodel. And let's start with the first one. How about Bill Wright's table over here? What are the messages this might send?
That one is like, I need to move on to another company because I will be limited on increasing my salary unless I don't get promoted.
One moment, Javier. There's a microphone coming your way.
I was saying like, under that scenario, the employee may feel that they need to move on to another company because if they don't grow, their salary is not going to increase, because they are top cap.
That's right. But what's the message being sent? What are you saying to the person who's experiencing this by that action? The result may be they leave, but performance matters less.
Yes. Yeah.
The message is that the better you are, then the slower we're going to increase your compensation.
Yeah.
And the worse you are, the more we're going to advance it. Does that make sense? Did anybody have a different message? Is there a positive message here? In the back. Mark.
No, I really appreciate it. It's so cool to be able to try to come up with both sides of this. So one of the positives of this particular scenario is that people that stay in the same role and get to the top of their pay curve and continue to go beyond market rate end up being very high targets during leadership layoffs because they end up at an expensive spot. They cost a lot more money. And so for me, it is actually important that you don't get out of market. So it would be the idea that they could be promoted into a new role. They can actually take on a new challenge and do something at a higher level if they're looking for higher pay above market significantly.
Right. Did anyone come up with a positive interpretation of this?
Well, we didn't necessarily come up with a positive interpretation, but one of the things we looked at is what are some other things you can do for that employee that would prevent them from going looking somewhere else. Developmental opportunities, those types of things where, as Bill said, the company may not be in a position where either that they can expand that next level to accommodate another promotion for that person, but other developmental opportunities, potentially, like you talked about, profit-linked compensations, things like that, that wouldn't necessarily affect the pay band.
But that's a mitigation, and I agree with you, that's a mitigation strategy before they hit the end of the wall there. But I still haven't heard a positive message out of it, right? It's hard to get to. Side note, if you see people who are advancing in their range and they get around the 60th percentile, they're above the 50th percentile, around the 60th, 70th, that's high time to have a developmental conversation with them about their career aspirations. And before they hit that wall at the end of the range, you want to be talking early about what else would you like to do? And sometimes the answer is, really, I like this job. And well, ultimately, if the market doesn't move, you will hit a limit to your base compensation, but we're not going to slow you down on the way. We're going to get you to that maximum at the same pace as anybody else is advancing according to the same performance. All right. Any other comments on that? Wrong direction? So let's go to the second one. Negotiating the lowest possible amount for a new hire. What's the message? And by the way, will they ever find out that they were paid less than someone else? Yes, always. You think? So what's the message? Let's pick this table. Did you come up with a positive or negative message from this?
I think it erodes trust for
I was pointing to them. We'll get back to you.
I guess it's that we'll pay you as little as we can get away with.
Exactly. Right. Any positive message?
No, I don't think so. I think you're expecting a lot from you're expecting this, I don't know, let's just say hypothetical, a professional unicorn, but I'm not willing to pay for it. That's silly. Like,
That's kind of the message.
yeah, that's the message.
There's one, I'll offer a small positive message that no one would believe, and that's that we're trying to maintain our labor costs at the lowest possible level so we can afford everyone here.
But I guess part of it too is the positive too is that sometimes somebody could, make it seem like they are that unicorn, and then you do pay them that high amount, and then you're like, oh, what did I get myself into? So I guess there is a positive to kind of being, more careful and how you bring, how much you invest in someone.
And that's a good spin. Patty, did you want to mention something?
No, it's all right.
You sure? Okay. How about this one? Roles are not openly communicated to internal candidates. People are promoted according to leadership's appointment. How about our friends from Wallbank? What did you guys think about? Silence fills the room.
This is the one we struggled with the most, so I don't know if we have necessarily a clean report out here, because we've debated on times when it's clear that there's only one person who is qualified and has a desire to move into a role, and it's obvious that that's the next step for them. Should you open it to the whole organization, or versus what you potentially risk if there's others who are eyeing that role? So I guess from the question of what message does that send, on the positive side, it shows that we're having conversations and we're listening to the aspirations of at least that individual. On the negative side, maybe it shows, and also on the positive side, if you understand the aspirations and you have relationships, back to the discussion yesterday, if you have relationships with the rest of the organization, you have a good feel that they're not looking for that role, then it's low risk. On the negative side, though, if somehow you missed someone's aspirations and they had a role, then that there's risk there.
Right, this is a tough one. Scott.
This one is a dilemma in a couple situations that I wanted to even ask you is if we're in a position where we have a domain of expertise that we have nobody in, like for example, we're going to hire a chief counsel as a new role. communicating that is important, but it's also kind of disingenuous to post a chief counsel role when we know that there's nobody in the organization that is in fact an attorney that can fulfill that role. So it's a really tricky one. I think if you have jobs that people are growing into, it's one thing, but what do you do when you have a completely new domain of expertise that's required? Another one that we're finding right now is there's an incredible increase in compliance around technology that's being required by our clients. That is a new domain of expertise that we are completely unprepared for. So it's a question more than anything. I see the dilemma around why do you not post roles, especially ones where people grow into it, but that other one has always been a tricky one for me.
Yeah. Let's assume you have a job description that has all that good information in it. And so you know what you need. There are two conditions here. One is where you have a career progression where someone is ready to advance to the next level in their career progression, and they've earned it by their performance. Versus, and you're not adding people, you're simply advancing someone in their career. You're not adding a new person. Versus, you're adding a new person in an additional role. If you have a practice of not openly communicating to internal candidates, and it's only a matter of leadership decision, what's the reaction that people will get when they say, who's this new person in a role that I didn't know was going to be available and I would have been interested in? What's the message?
You're not valued, and I'm not even going to take the time. Like,
You don't know me? You don't know what I'm interested in? Back of the room.
So that's true, but what about in the case where if you do that, the practice that we certainly understand, what about the other one when you have to bring in somebody new? It's a matter of if you don't do one, it's going to be harder to bring in the new role, the originating a new role?
Let's handle that example next after this, because that's a different case.
Yeah.
All right, so on the positive side, I'd say that this is a highly effective way of promoting, especially for leadership, because, and if I may quote Stan Sewitch, pay for results, not activity. So it's very easy for leadership to see the results and kind of decide based on that whether or not to promote an employee to a higher position. However, it's only their direct supervisors who can actually give value to the work they do. So how would I know how their work ethic would be if I only see the results? So I don't know what happens behind the scenes.
Well, you're right. The person who works the closest with someone should have, and particularly their coach, should have the best estimation of what they perform. Not the only one, because oftentimes they work with multiple people, multiple leaders. Our organizations are matrix. But I want to drill us back to this statement. Roles are not. This is a practice that is pervasive in this X company, this mythical company. Roles are not openly communicated to internal candidates. So when someone is filled in a new role, a new person joins the company, if someone else felt that they were interested in it but weren't asked, they didn't know if they were qualified or not. They didn't get the feedback. They didn't get a chance to put their name in the hat. If it's only about who's appointed, then the message is, I'll just give it to you, the message is it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. Who do you have a relationship with? Did you go to the right cocktail party? Did you have a chance encounter with a senior leader that turned out to be positive? And a lot of times, when senior leaders start to look out over the organization and they look for people who are high potential and they start selecting folks into roles, their decisions are made on relatively small segments of interaction with not the comprehensive history and information about their broad range of capabilities. Study after study has found that. People selected into specific experiences based on limited amount of exposure with people who are influential. there are going to be roles that you're not going to be able to post. If there's nobody, the engineer role at WD-40 Company, nobody else was even close. It was a completely different career field. However, if people know that the job is there, if it's an opening, we might be surprised. Someone might say, I'd like to become an engineer. How do I do that?
Or I'm going to school for that. Like, did they know that?
Right. Who's talking? Go ahead.
I guess I would give a shout out to WD-40 Company and especially Steve Brass, right? Because when he took over the helm, he opened up a lot of different roles. And I think what it showed to us when he actually sent out personal notes about these roles, and what it showed to us as employees is he was also willing to say, I don't know as a leader everyone else's personal interests, but here's what I'm looking for to help kind of grow our business, right? And I would say that I would ask, like, even if you think you don't have an internal candidate for that role in manufacturing or in I'm sure it's AI that you might be alluding to over there, people understand they have development career paths themselves. They're pursuing personal things outside of it. And if we think about how many people put mental health on that, but they didn't share that, they haven't shared that in their business, how many people have personal goals that they are pursuing outside of business that you might not know about?
Exactly. And that would be my response to you, Scott, that you can say to the organization, we're looking outside for this, and someone might say, but I'd like that in the future. And then you're addressing their aspirational interests. Interest of time. Okay, certain people are selected for special programs and because they're viewed as high potential. It's somewhat aligned with number 3. What's the positive message about that? And I think there is one for there.
We're actively looking for future leaders in the company.
Right. And we're creating developmental opportunities for them. What's a possible negative? How do you get into the club? How do I get the pin that says I'm hypo? I don't want the pin that says I'm low-po.
If I may, Stan, I think your 3 and 4 are linked. Like if you do, again, make that open, that those high potential roles are available, then you're sending a message that we want leaders to grow here, right?
That's right. And in fact, at W40 in our leadership development programs, we invited everybody. It's voluntary. Whether you're a current, quote, leader or not, everybody leads something, and maybe they have aspirations for leading later. And maybe if they go through the leadership development program and they say, I never want to do that again, we've just saved them a lot of angst. Last one. People are allowed to see only their own salary range and cannot view other position descriptions. That's still going on. What's the possible positive, and what is the negative message?
I'll yell it. I mean, I think that, I open up, compensation is actually one of the last things I opened up transparency in the last run that I took. It was 13 years, and they had nothing open book-wise. And so it took a time to be able to train and teach transparency across all systems, safety systems and people systems and issue systems and quality issues. And compensation took a while before we got to the point where the system was mature enough to handle the conflict that would arise. We also were able to make it a little bit less painful because we were able to make adjustments while we were figuring out how to get to full transparency. So I think that's a positive of leaving it till wise, to make it wise timing-wise.
Well, you gave me a great segue. Thank you. Because transparency equals trust. We just heard that multiple times over the last day and a half. But you have to get there in a methodical way. It takes education first. If people don't understand how the system works, where the data comes from, how the decisions are made, and if those decision processes don't make sense, they're not logical, people will not trust it. So you have to put a logical system in place. and then educate people about it. At WD-40, Joanne and I and others, it took us 2.5 years from start. We had to first do the job descriptions. We had to do the market analysis. We had to analyze where people were, had to find out where we had made mistakes, correct those mistakes, educate people all the way, and then finally we opened the kimono and everybody could look at any job description and see what salary range it was in and how much that range paid by country. And we got 2 questions, Joanne? Maybe 3? So you have to measure twice and then cut once. You have to do it right before you open the door. But once you are transparent about it, once you are transparent about the opportunities for experiences, for roles, you're transparent about the requirements, the competencies, and what it takes to achieve pay and a new role. If you're transparent about the error sources in the labor market analysis, and there are error sources, and you just put it all out on the table, trust goes up. And trust equals engagement as well. Any last questions before we close up? Okay, sorry.
So I had posed to the previous speaker the question about performance management tying in like the ratings with, merit increases, and I'm curious if you have some thoughts on that matter.
So a little different opinion. Like I said, I think we have to use categories. It's whether or not you communicate with that category that it's good or bad by your behavior. There's nothing wrong with being developing. There's nothing wrong with being advanced. We're equal people on the planet with different capabilities, and we're all on a journey. In my consulting company, I didn't have ratings. We had discussions, we had deep dialogue, and I would thank people for what they contributed. We'd talk about what they needed to develop. But I had a couple of folks that said, well, what's my rating? I said, okay, if you're going to force me. So I gave him back a little picture, and there were 3 fish. There was a tiny one, a bigger one, and a huge fish. And underneath it said, throw back, feed a person, invite the family. And I circled the appropriate fish. There you go. There's your rating. Everybody's different. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking about this subject, near and dear to my heart, as Davin said. Hope you got some use of it.